Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today is a book club episode with James Eglinton. He is going to be talking to us about his new Crossway book, Personality and Worldview, J.H. Bavinck. For our YouTube audience, here's what it looks like. You could go to Crossway's website and find it. Also a forward by Timothy Keller as well. So if you go to our show notes with that Crossway link, you can find this book. You can also, other resources, other things that James Eglinton has written about. I know he's been on our show before, actually, on a Herman Bavinck book. He was like our second book club ever. So it's good to see him again. And then also, just some other information about Dr. Eglinton, as well as how to find a Reformed or confessional church near your area if you need to find a church to call home. Also, just information on how to communicate with myself or Peter, questions or anything like that. We're on Twitter and Instagram, and we have an email address, guiltgracepod@gmail.com. And then also, just please check out our current Season 6 Introduction to Reformed Theology. We're going to be, all our guests are from Westminster, California, so we want to do a big shout out to Westminster, California as well, and we'll have some information in our show notes about that seminary school for you, as well as a ad about halfway through this episode. So let Peter further introduce James Eglinton today.
Yeah, we have Dr. James Eglinton. He is... he's both a Dutch pastor. He's in Scotland. He's professor at University of Edinburgh, so it's not University of Edinburgh for us Americans who
No, Edinburgh.
It is Edinburgh.
If you're really local, you call it Embra.
Edinburgh, there we go. I like
Embra,
it.
yeah. E-M-B-R-A.
We want to say things right. He's Meldrum Senior Lecturer in Reformed Theology, and like Nick said, we had him on for his Baker academic book on Herman Bavinck, who's J.H. Bavinck's uncle, if I have the relative stuff.
That's right.
But it's a pleasure having you back on the show, Dr. Eglinton.
Thanks. Great to be here. Great to see you guys again.
Yeah, it's good to see you. And for some weird reason, I have a hard time saying Eglinton. Is there like something?
You got it right there. Yeah, Eglinton. Yeah, perfect.
Eglinton. Okay. I want to put like an N before the G, but I know the N is at the T.
Yeah, it's at the end.
Yeah, it's just a weird little quirk. But that's fun little fact about you. If you want to tell our audience a little bit more, you're a what's called a polyglot. You speak multiple languages. If you can kind of give our listeners a little sneak peek of the languages that you know and how you learn them. Sure.
Yeah. So I speak English, obviously. Everyone in Scotland does. Cúideach Gaelic acum, Gaelic and Halapa, Cananilla, Havishing and Bring a Shaw. So I speak Scottish Gaelic. It's a Celtic language. So I grew up with that in my family. It's an Indo-European language like English, but it's as different from English as, I don't know, Hindi or something like that. So it's a very, very different language. Grammatically, really like Hebrew in lots of ways. It's a verb, subject, object language. So that made learning Hebrew in seminary a bit easier, actually.
Maybe I could translate. Try to learn Gaelic because I know Hebrew.
Could translate word from word from Hebrew into Gaelic, and then the word order makes complete sense. Ik ben ook, ik spreek Nederlands. Als een derde taal. So I speak Dutch as well. I did my PhD on Herman Bavinck, had to learn it for him, to read his works. I lived for 3 years in the Netherlands and lived completely immersed in Dutch, apart from at home. So outside of the house, everything in life was absolutely in Dutch, at work and church and social life for 3 years. So by the end of that, I felt just totally at home and could be myself in Dutch in pretty much any situation. La quatrième langue, c'est le français. Speak French as well. I spent a couple of summers as an exchange student in Paris, and my first summer, I was telling Peter before we started recording, I lived with a bunch of Catholic priests and studied at the Catholic Institute there, and had a lot of fun speaking about theology and French with those guys for a month. And then I spent a second summer there as a PhD student as well, living with an evangelical family, and learned to try and speak French with the kind of register that you need to talk to teenagers as well as to talk to adults and to work in an academic context there. So so I speak those 4, and I love languages. I'm a complete language nerd. I do this for fun.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah. So before a real question on J.H. Bavinck, let's maybe if our listeners haven't heard our first episode with you, which is our second book club, or the podcast, we'll talk about your podcast as well. Let our listeners know a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do at Edinburgh.
Yeah. So I'm from Scotland. I grew up here, and other than 3 years in the Netherlands, I've lived in Scotland for my whole life. I teach at the University of Edinburgh. I've been here for 10 years on faculty. I have an endowed position in Reformed Theology. So the School of Divinity at Edinburgh, theology has been taught at Edinburgh since the 16th century. It was like the first chair that was established when the university was established was the chair of divinity. But the school that I teach in was founded actually by my own denomination, the Free Church of Scotland, in like 176 years ago, by a guy called Thomas Chalmers, who was Christian, social visionary theologian. And part of his grand vision for the Christian renewal of Scotland was to have a modern Christian university that would rival Edinburgh University. And the first faculty that he founded was a faculty of theology. But he was part of an ecclesiastical movement called the Disruption, which is when the Free Church of Scotland left the Church of Scotland. Happened in 1843. And this was a massive rift in Scottish life, actually, throughout the whole country. And so many professors across the Scottish universities and all faculties joined the Free Church that the idea was, hey, our church already has enough professors in it in every faculty that we could just have our own university. So New College, where I teach, was founded as the first faculty that was intended to become a Christian university. So a little bit like Abraham Kuyper and the Free University in Amsterdam, but before Kuyper had that idea. But then it never quite became that, so it stayed a School of Divinity, and then eventually in the 20th century it became part of the University of Edinburgh, and then you have this theology faculty that goes back to the 16th century, which was actually very traditional in lots of ways, and then this quite dynamic new free church institution that joined and then merged together, and that's where I teach now. So I've been there for teaching there for the last 10 years. I did my PhD there. Between the PhD and going back to teach there, that was when I had 3 years in the Netherlands. I was on the faculty of the Theological University in Kampen, which is where Bavinck was a professor, both of the Bavincks actually. So yeah, that's a bit of an intro.
Awesome. Great.
Perfect. Thank you. And this is obviously a obvious question. We've talked about how Herman Bavinck, most of our audience has probably heard of him. And then this is about J.H. Bavinck. You hinted at the answer earlier, but I'll let you repeat it. Who is J.H. Bavinck, and how did your interest begin with his work specifically?
Yeah. So J.H. Stands for Johann Herman, nephew of Herman Bavinck. J.H.'s dad was Herman Bavinck's brother. He was a pastor as well, a Reformed pastor. So he was a really fascinating thinker in lots of ways. He studied theology and then had two periods of his life where he worked on Java, in what's now in what we now think of as Indonesia. At that point in the Dutch East Indies. And then after that, alongside that, so he spent some time working as a pastor in the Netherlands. He had a period in between his two periods on Java as a pastor in the Netherlands as well. And then for the largest chunk of his life after that, he taught missiology at two institutions, at the Free University of Amsterdam and also in Kampen. So he's known as a missiologist primarily. One of his best-known books is called An Introduction to the Science of Missions. Yep. So that was actually my very first introduction to J.H. Bavinck when I was when I was a seminary student. And so I went to seminary just when Herman's dogmatics were coming out in English. So I think Volume 1 came out in my just before my first year of seminary, and Volume 2 came out just like at the end of my first year. And so I'd heard about this Herman guy, and I'd done a bit of reading in Volume 1 of the Reformed Dogmatics, and then went looking in the Bavinck shelf in the library, and then found, whoa, missiology as well. This guy's amazing. And then spent some time reading the Introduction to the Science of Missions, and was just blown away by how one person could move in all of these different areas, and then discovered afterwards that this was actually uncle and nephew. So he's well known for missiology. but he was actually he was a bit of a polymath in his own way, a bit like Herman too. So he also did a lot of really important work in psychology that is absolutely fascinating. And this book, Personality and Worldview, is a bridge into that. Yeah. He also was a biblical commentator. He wrote a fascinating commentary on the New Testament, and it's a really superb work in lots of ways, really creative and original. He was like a broadcaster, like a public theologian, I guess we might call him nowadays. And the way that he communicates all of this is with a very light touch. So Corey Brock, a friend of mine, will talk about him sometimes as the C.S. Lewis of the Neo-Calvinist tradition. And so he has this very a light touch way of writing that actually, so if you read his New Testament commentary, when he's talking about Jesus quite often, and he'll talk about why Jesus communicates in parables primarily rather than an abstract reasoning, he'll talk about how it's like a psychological insight into Jesus and also Jesus' psychological insight into other humans, that he's always so studious and attentive and looking at people and trying to understand them and therefore wanting to communicate to them in the world that they're in. And so for him, Jesus, it's almost like he wears his most truly profound psychological insights about humans quite lightly, in that he'll talk about a lost coin or a lost sheep or something like that. But underneath that is just the largest imaginable iceberg of divine wisdom and human wisdom as well. So you see him trying to model that, I think, a lot in how J.H. Bavinck teaches and writes, and you see this throughout his whole written corpus, that there's a light touch there, but it's so profound at the same time. So a truly fascinating thinker in lots of ways. So I could present him in, like, that would be, like a bare bones CV of J.H. Bavinck. Yeah. But I think two of the most interesting ways to think about him are that he's also significant in a mid-20th century context for similar kind of reasons to someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So J.H. Bavinck lived through World War II and lived in the occupied Netherlands. And a lot of his most interesting theology is written under Nazi occupation, where he writes in hiding, in effect. So he lived in a house in Amsterdam that had a basement, and he basically blacked out the basement with thick curtains, and he set up a bicycle generator, and he would have his kids pedal the bicycle, just so that he would have electricity to have a light bulb that he could write by in this basement. So one of his most fascinating books is Between the Beginning and the End. It's like his attempt to do something like almost like Augustine's City of God merged with biblical hermeneutics, and trying to address the needs of his own day there. So he wrote that in his basement with his kids pedaling a bicycle, and it's explicitly anti-Nazi Neo-Calvinism, a rejection of the Führer. So you could think of him in almost like Bonhoeffer-like categories about some of his significance. So that's one way you could think of him. But he's also a bit like the Neo-Calvinist tradition's Hudson Taylor. So I mentioned that he spends these two periods on Java. So but in the first period, he's very much a pastor to expats, and still quite Western and a little bit alien to the culture of the people who surround him. But in the second period, he goes back and he takes a local name. He really goes native in a Hudson Taylor style way, and what he tries to establish there, I mean, it's almost a little bit like Francis Schaeffer as well, in that he basically finds something like L'Abri, but it's a pagoda where you can come and join this family of faith in ways that subversively fulfill the way that the local culture teaches you to be human, in all kinds of different ways that are very thoughtfully worked out in terms of how you use language, how you understand what a family is. So he has this absolutely fascinating life where you can see lots of traits of other very notable, remarkable Christians, and his life story actually holds all of these together in a distinct kind of way as well.
Yeah, we'll see that as we dig into this work, because I think he pulls a lot of strands into this, and people will read these threads through, and you'll recognize, I think, more recent authors, and we'll talk about some recent authors that kind of sound like Bavinck, J.H. Bavinck too. And so getting into the title, because the title is not just a title, but I think it's strewn throughout the book. And you talk about personality and worldview, and we'll get to world vision, but that's also a pretty big category in this. So how does JH define these two terms? Because he's not new in it, but he actually kind of codifies them a little bit. And how are each related to the other term?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background to the book in the first place that will help define the terms. So the background is, he wrote this in 1928, or he wrote in 1927 originally as public lectures that he gave not to theologians, but actually to engineering students, which is really interesting. So there's a technical university in Delft in the Netherlands, still there, very successful university, and there was a Reformed engineering society for Reformed students there. And so these are, 18 to 22-year-olds, and they had grown up under the influence of Abraham Kuyper. And Abraham Kuyper, is this neo-Calvinist worldview thinker. And Kuyper himself probably had a bit of a tendency to reduce people to their worldviews in some kind of abstract sense. So the idea is, oh, you're a Calvinist. Okay, well, this is the Calvinist worldview, therefore I know you. And, tell me your worldview and I'll tell you who you are. Oh, you're Roman Catholic. Well, this is a Roman Catholic worldview, and so on. And what you see a lot of in the 1920s in those Christian circles with young people in the Netherlands was a pushback against that by these students who were an early part of what in the mid 20th century became a pretty rampant individualism. You can't reduce me to a worldview. I'm an individual. I have free agency. I choose what I will become.
Sounds similar.
And,
to what we have
sounds
today,
similar, indeed. Yeah. So an earlier stage of that. But what these students were aware of was that that the kind of worldview discourse that they'd grown up with didn't seem to give a good account of something that seemed very real to them, which was personality, that every individual is unique. So the big struggle of the day was personality or worldview, or personality versus worldview. And the title of the book in Dutch is just persoonlijkheid en wereldbeschouwing, personality and worldview. So the conjunction is really important, that it's and rather than either or versus. So JH wants to try and demonstrate that that the worldview concept probably has more merit than these students thought that it had, but he also wants to do that in a way that reckons with the realities of how every individual is actually unique. And so in terms of what a worldview is for JH and what a personality is, actually, the key idea that we have to get to for him at the beginning is actually another term, which is soul. So he begins with what is a soul in the first place anyway, because it's the starting point with how we talk about what is a human being. So for him, a human being, in your inner life, and that's really what he means by the soul, in your inner life you have various capacities as a human. So you're receptive to things that are around you. So you receive impressions of things constantly. That happens to us for every millisecond of every day. We have a capacity to conserve those. So we remember things, and that process of conserving some memories is also a kind of sifting capacity where we remember some things and forget others. And we're constantly making judgments about which impressions to take in and which to ignore, because there are too many of them at any given time for you to take in everything. But we also have this internal capacity in our inner life to desire, and we're fundamentally driven by desire as human beings. So it's a very Augustinian psychology, a very Augustinian take of what is a human being on the inside. Okay, so your soul is actually the inner you that has these common human capacities, but every human, those capacities that we have are coordinated differently. So we all have the same capacities, but they're not quite ordered in the same way, and the balance that these capacities have is different in every individual. And so some people are far more, let's say, receptive. Like if there's an imbalance, you can become a very passive person if you're too receptive, if those capacities are a bit overgrown, and then you're not active enough in your desire to change things in the world. But some people can be, control freaks, where the imbalance is a different imbalance, where desire completely overgrows receptivity, so you don't listen to other people, for example. So everyone is differently, has a different configuration, and because of the fall, actually, for him, a different sort of disorder of the faculties of the inner life. But you become aware, because you're self-conscious as a human, that you have this distinct inner life. And when your self-consciousness becomes aware of itself and you start to speak, you speak as an I, and you're aware that you are you and not someone else. Okay, so, and then the thing that speaks as an I that emerges there is your personality. So that's kind of what he's getting at with personality in the first place, that it's a distinct way of moving from self-consciousness to self-knowledge, and that you are a distinct individual. So every individual human has a distinct personality, but at the same time, personality for him is not just something that you're kind of fixed into, that's unchangeable, in the way that a lot of nowadays we might think of, the results of like the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs as, that's your personality type and you're locked into it. Yeah. So for J.H. Bavinck, you have a personality that emerges, but personality is actually something that you should strive to become, that you should strive to change, actually, and become a better person than you are. And for him, that's actually the core of the call of Christianity, to be converted, to repent, to be sanctified, to progress. So personality is both something that you are, but it's also something that you must become. So your personality is really the individuality of being human, and he wants to hold on to that. But worldview is also a really important idea for him. Okay, and so worldview is, if you were to imagine a truly capacious, all-encompassing, objective, truthful, and wise perspective on the world and on life within it, that would be a perfect and true worldview. So a true worldview, in the fullest sense of the word, is utter objectivity about the world and life within it, and it's a view. Okay, so it's kind of like if you imagine. So an illustration I use in the beginning of the book in the introduction is, if you were to walk around New York City and only have your first-person perspective on it, you can see one set of things at a time. But imagine if you've never, flown into New York City and seen it from the air. If you've never climbed a skyscraper and had a view over the whole thing. A worldview is like that kind of perspective on the entirety of life in the world. And in that sense, actually, for J.H. Bavinck, the only one who truly has a perfect worldview, who is utterly objective in his view on all of this and wise and all of that, is actually God himself. So God has a worldview, a view of our world, and God is truly objective in what he knows of this world, and truly wise in all of that. And humans, if you think of where personality begins to emerge, if you're talking about an individual human, you're talking about like the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of a subjective take on the world, and where God's knowledge of the world, his view of the world, is objective. So that means that J.H. Bavinck needs to have a distinct kind of category or idea, a label, to put on what kind of knowledge a human has of the world at the beginning. And then, the challenge is not just to accept passively, well, I am a personality and I am just as I am, but I need to become a personality as well. I need to grow and progress. What kind of concept can J.H. Bavinck supply that will explain that worldview is really important, that there is actually a true take on life in the world, but only God has the perfect worldview. But nonetheless, as creatures, we're made to move towards our Creator. We're made to grow in our knowledge and wisdom and living coram Deo. So that's where you get this third term, world vision. So world vision for J.H. Bavinck is related to the idea of worldview, but it's like, to stick with the idea of walking around New York City, let's say, and if you've never had a view of the whole city, you do still have a perspective on it, and it's, let's say, an immediate first-person perspective, and that's let's say, your vision as you walk around it. So the idea of world vision is that every human, as every distinct individual, emerges into human life, into whatever culture you're from, whatever society you're in. The culture that forms you most immediately, so that could be your parents, your primary caregivers, it can be the village that you grow up in, or the city, the wider culture, your teachers at school, the media that influences you as you grow up. That formative environment gives you a set of, it gives you a lens, let's say, through which you can have a vision of the world. It gives you a set of intuitions or assumptions that you can use to get by day to day. You could use it to walk around New York street by street, but it's not the same as having a view of the whole thing from that bird's eye perspective, or in the truest sense, actually from a God's eye perspective. Yep. So world vision is an affirmation of how humans navigate the world, but it's also a challenge to progress from this rudimentary world vision, actually to put it to the test, and then try and progress from a world vision to a world view. Okay. So maybe it might be helpful for listeners as well to use to highlight one more illustration from the intro to the book, which is that a world vision is like it's like a compass. So it can guide your next step. In that, a compass will show you, it'll orient you in certain directions in the world, but a compass isn't the same as a map. And a world view, rather than a world vision, is more like a map than a compass. So you could use a world view to think about not just where I am here in the world, but also where that person is 1,000 miles away. And I can give some kind of comprehensive sense of how this all fits together that then I use to navigate the world in a very different way. if you've only got a compass, you'll try and move around the world very differently to someone who actually has a map of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So worldview and world vision are really important categories. And then within that, the challenge of personality is to become a personality, actually, not just to be as you are, but to put the way that your personality is configured and oriented by your community, by your starting point, by the world vision that you inherit as you're born into a particular place and time. Put that all to the test, and your personality will change. And for J.H. Bavinck, actually, the thing you put it to the test with is the gospel itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going into one of those illustrations too, what was helpful is going back to the map of a worldview is the map, and then it crumples up into a ball. If you crumple up that map into a ball, that's kind of like a world vision, because there's only so much you can see with that crumpled up ball until you unwrinkle it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like we mentioned earlier, Tim Keller had a really good foreword in this book, and in his forward, he mentions that the concept of Christianity as a worldview has lost its luster among younger Christians for a multitude of reasons. They say it's too rational, simple, individualistic, triumphalistic, etc. How has worldview been wrongly understood, and how does JH actually help us toward a better definition?
Yeah,
based on what Dr. Keller was saying.
Yeah. I think Tim is primarily addressing younger American Christians. Mm-hmm. So worldview it's a distinct kind of concept in American, particularly evangelical culture, where worldview is something that you can reduce to, 10 points in a list. And hey, if you agree with these 10 points, I confidently tell you have a Christian worldview, or you have a biblical worldview. Mm-hmm. You can find videos on YouTube that promise to equip you with a Christian worldview in under 5 minutes. Yeah. And then once you assent to this, then you're kind of victorious now. Anyway, you're with the right group, and you know who you are, who your group is, and it's all really quick and easy. It's a bit like, I use this illustration in the intro to the book as well. It's like Neo learning Kung Fu in the Matrix. You just need to be plugged in, and then boom, you have it. But in J.H. Bavinck's way of thinking, it's a bit more like learning Kung Fu in the real world. It's going to take a really long time. It's going to be quite painful.
It's not in a vacuum.
It'll take a lot of effort. So J.H. Bavinck's way of thinking about worldview, which he inherits from Herman Bavinck, is that worldview isn't something that you acquire very quickly. It's not a rapid information dump. Instead, it's like having a map, but you actually have to make the map yourself. And that takes ages. You can't just rush that at all. It takes really careful exploration to do that kind of cartography. So it means something quite different in the Dutch neo-Calvinist tradition than in mainstream American evangelicalism anyway. But I think for the kind of things that Tim highlights in American evangelicalism are, as you say, that it's too rationalistic. So if you agree with these 10 points on this PowerPoint, you have a Christian worldview, as though the way that you move around the world and the way you live within it is just about 10 abstract points in abstraction, and as though there are no other features to how humans live in terms of living in more imaginative ways. Or actually, you might have like 10 points that you say on paper that you assent to, but your life might be have all these factors that are not very consistent with those points in the list, for example. So reducing everything to abstract points, seen by a lot of Christians in the US as too rational. That it is also too simple, which is an extension of that it's too individualistic. I have, like, when you're looking for worldviews, you look for the individuals who hold to them. And the purest expression of the worldview is always found in an individual who assents to it. In the Dutch neo-Calvinist way of thinking about this, and particularly in this book by J.H. Bavinck, the individual is probably the worst place to look to see what a worldview really looks like. Instead, you actually have to zoom the picture right out and look at entire civilizations and cultures, because individuals themselves are really messy and complicated creatures. So he has the exact opposite instinct with where you would look to see what a worldview really looks like. Other things that Tim mentions, like the triumphalist element that, hey, I subscribe to the right worldview, therefore mine is better than yours. And, I've got the upper hand against you if you subscribe to a different worldview. So for all those reasons, Tim identifies the worldview concept has lost a lot of its luster, as you say, in American evangelicalism. Before Personality and Worldview, Corey Brock-Gracie-Tanto and I translated Herman Bavinck's book, Christian Worldview. It came out first in 1904, because we thought that it was a really excellent text that introducing English speakers today, to a very different worldview conversation through Herman. And that's where you see Herman developing something like a map-making idea. So that's our illustration to describe what he does, but that's really what he's talking about. So if you want to build up a worldview, it's going to take a long time to ask some quite hard questions about what am I? How can I know things? Can I know anything? What's my life for? What's the relationship of my existence to how I act in the world? And they're really big, complex, and weighty philosophical questions, and you can't answer them in a hurry. So that's a really helpful book, because it highlights that what Herman Bavinck means by worldview is not what most American evangelicals mean by the term. But this book is a bit different in that, so if you think about it like this, for Herman Bavinck, the idea is worldview is really important, and you need to make that map for yourself. And you need to start doing some cartography to live well and wisely within the world, and to be godly. But the problem is, what about people who are not interested in map making? What guides their lives? What's the basis of how they live? And you see an idea in Herman Bavinck that for most people, the ways that they think are more noble than how they actually live. So we all have higher ideals than we really truly live by, and very few of us are very tightly conformed to our highest abstract ideals, theologically, philosophically, morally. So if that's true, actually, then is worldview just an abstraction that none of our lives really conform to? What of the people who are not interested in map making? And that's where J.H. Bavinck supplements what Herman has done, particularly with the concept of world vision. Because for J.H. Bavinck, if you want to find worldviews, they are out there. They are inestimably important, in that worldviews are both formed by and also form civilizations. They form cultures. And for J.H. Bavinck, this is why someone who is formed in the United States or in Western Europe is just different in recognizable ways to someone who is formed in mainland China or in Vietnam or in I don't know, in Botswana. You have recognizable configurations of actually these deep psychological faculties where people are recognizable in broad terms in terms of where they come from, whilst at the same time every individual within those is going to be a unique version of how to be human in that context. But so you have to have some kind of concept that explains the diversity of starting points that humans have, and also a concept that explains how people live if they're not actually interested in worldview. So the worldview is out there, and you see glimmers of it, you see fragments of it in how people formed within those cultures live. But the individual is very unlikely to be a superb embodiment of a Christian worldview or a Confucian worldview or something like that. So the world vision concept is an important one there in supplementing what Herman did. So I think that's what got me really excited about the book when I read it in the first place, and I think that's what Tim is quite excited about as well. It gives you a lot it gives you a very useful tool in understanding yourself, but also in understanding other people.
Yeah, and so getting into this and these not developing in a vacuum or we're just kind of thinking sticks, because J.H. Throughout this book, when people read it, and I would obviously very much encourage that, he engages with a lot of scholarship and philosophers, psychologists. So he's not just developing this kind of in his own kind of thoughts and processes, or I guess you can say strictly, you can call biblical, where he's just looking at the biblical data and forming a worldview. But who are some of his conversation partners that he's dialoguing with while writing this and thinking through some of these issues?
Yeah. I think that there are 3 implicit conversation partners who are extremely important, but he doesn't name them as much, and they are Augustine. So he is a deeply his psychological insights are also conditioned by Augustine. So I think if you haven't read Augustine's Confessions, you probably should anyway, as a human being. Is such a worthy book. It's but I think if you've got a little bit of familiarity with Augustine's Confessions, it will open up this book to you in a completely new way. So one of the central psychological insight in Augustine's Confessions is that the shape of every human life is that we are both running from and running away from God at the same time. And that's actually just this chaos in the fallen human psyche, that we're made for God and we're always looking for him, but we're also always hiding from him and not looking for him at the same time. And so rather than some kind of conversion narrative of I was running away from God and then boom, I was converted and now I run towards God. Even before I was converted, in Augustine's way of thinking, God was looking for me and I was looking for him, and it's a much more complex picture than I guess a lot of evangelicals are used to as well, and how we think about soteriology and anthropology. So that Augustine, J.H. loves Augustine, and he's so profoundly influenced by him. So you see profoundly Augustinian ways of thinking in this book, like with the idea of worldview. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that in the true sense of the word, we can only really talk about God himself having a proper view of the world, in the fullest sense, the pinnacle of all of that. But that doesn't mean that humans shouldn't try and pursue worldviews. In fact, it's the reason that we should, in trying to move towards our creator, for J.H. Bavinck. But he has this very Augustinian suspicion of our idolatrous hearts. And he will say that that every attempt to build a worldview is both an attempt to move towards and also to hide from God. And that means that worldview building is something that you really have to do, but you have to do it in a spirit of constant repentance and just a deep realism about what it means that the fall really did happen, and that you do this in the light of that. So he's so Augustinian. He doesn't name him too much in this book, but he doesn't need to. His way of thinking is so Augustinian. Herman Bavinck, I guess I don't need to say too much on that, because I've already mentioned how this book is his follow-up, I think, to Herman Bavinck's Christian Worldview. But probably the third figure is implicit in this book, really, and that's Sigmund Freud. You could maybe throw in Carl Jung as well, actually, if I can add a fourth figure who's there really implicitly. So he's so conversant with 20th century psychology, and particularly psychoanalysis. And what he's trying to do is demonstrate that psychoanalysis, as a way of doing psychology in his day, yields some really great insights about the human condition, that we're always hiding from ourselves, that we suppress the truth about ourselves. And but J.H. Bavinck has this great idea that what makes Christianity so unique is that it can always out-explain any other attempt to make sense of life in the world. And actually, Christianity can really out-explain and critique also psychoanalysis. So, and for him, Paul out-explains it in Romans 1, in talking about the knowledge of God that we have, that we suppress in unrighteousness. So that way of thinking as well, where it's Augustine in dialogue with Freud and Jung, implicitly is there throughout this book and how he thinks about personality. But in terms of explicit conversation partners in the book, probably the two most important that he names are Spinoza and Kant. So there are parts of this book that are, they're very philosophical, and he's giving these lectures not to philosophers but to engineers. But he wants you to think about the high points of Western philosophy, and Spinoza as the high point of rationalism. So he's full of admiration for Spinoza as someone who really tried to pursue truth and did so very nobly in all kinds of complex ways and develop a very capacious view of the world. And what he loves about Spinoza is that alongside that, Spinoza was someone who really seemed to love God and wanted his creator, and who knew that he was made for God. But the failing of Spinoza is that he doesn't get that his system doesn't connect to that, and these things are there because he wants them both there rather than because they need each other. So so he's there, and Kant is there as well as the high point of the sophistication of Western philosophy for J.H. Bavinck. But Kant also, he's got his critiques of Kant and how Kant can't really account for important things in human personality either. So neither Kant nor Spinoza really gives you a livable philosophy of life to become a personality with. But so there are some parts of the book that if you don't have a background in philosophy, will be, they'll be harder reading. So I've tried to add a lot of things in footnotes that will maybe make really bear the burden a bit for you as a reader. But the point really for J.H. Bavinck is that after going through some, wading through some tough philosophy, he then gets onto how these philosophies don't really transfer into the lives of ordinary people. Actually,
they're not really livable.
They're not livable at a basic level, and that humans hunger and thirst for the answers to basic questions like, is there a God? Can I know him? And does this comfort me in the struggles of life? And actually, so the average human just needs something far more rudimentary than a lot of very nuanced attempts that. So what frustrates humans in terms of the livability of Spinoza or Kant for J.H. Bavinck is that they're, in an Augustinian way of thinking, Kant ascends this mountain towards God, and then with one hand he reaches out towards God, and with another he pushes God away. And Spinoza does the same thing. And if you're expecting an ordinary person to follow all that complexity, reading Spinoza is really tough. Reading Kant is hard work. And then they expect you to follow them all the way to such an existentially unsatisfying conclusion. That's why you don't have a lot of people who are very nuanced Kantians out there, Spinozans, despite them being the most nuanced Western thinkers in this point. So then so the point of him guiding you through this is really to get you beyond that, to see what do ordinary people do with this complexity, and really what they reduce them to is, for him, like the only two possible worldviews that people try and make livable are materialistic atheism or Christian theism. So it's really to get you to that point in the book. That's why he's kind of bedazzling these engineering students, probably with a depth of philosophy that they struggled with as well. But it's actually there rhetorically in the book for you to get to the point where you realize, I'm probably not following, or if I follow Spinoza all the way up the mountain, or Kant, it does feel really just unsatisfying if he does this kind of double take, the sleight of hand towards God, where you still can't really know God in the end.
That makes a lot of sense that he's Augustinian. Because
this is exactly what Augustine deals with. Exactly what he deals with in the Confessions. If I follow Cicero, if I follow these guys, it's just not going to lead me where I want to go.
I haven't read Confessions yet, but I'm almost done with City of God, and I'm actually, I think it's book 19. He talks a lot about virtues. and Augustine is talking a lot about virtues in Book 19, City of God. And at the same time, I'm reading your Personality and Worldview book, and I've already read very recently Herman Bavinck's Wonderful Works of God and What is Christianity. So you'd be really proud of me. I'm almost done with Augustine's City of God, and I've read 2 Bavinck books right before this book. So
great, good work. I love it. Yeah,
not too bad, not too shabby for a layperson, but it's
awesome. Well done.
That's helpful stepping into these terms and like where J.H. Bavinck's thought is. So here's another name to throw at you, Charles Taylor. So it is actually remarkably similar with Taylor's work on social imaginaries and J.H.'s work on worldview and personality. It can seem like J.H.'s work is before its time, written in the mid to late 20s, but most of the social cultural philosophers many are very familiar with now, didn't start writing until after the sexual revolution. So J.H. was a little before his time. How is J.H. able to do this when he was writing it?
Yeah. So I think it's a really good question and a good thing to observe. So, for listeners, again, if you don't know Charles Taylor, it's a Canadian philosopher. He wrote A Secular Age. And his idea of the social imaginary is that actually the best way to understand how humans function and exist and live within the world is that they imagine the world in lots of pre-theoretical ways. So if you think in those kinds of categories, and then you try and impose something like an abstract worldview that is, again, quite rational, a bit detached, a bit abstract, it doesn't seem to comport well with the imaginative way that humans make the world a livable environment for themselves, and how pre-theoretical that is. So I agree. I think that the world vision idea is remarkably similar to the social imaginary idea. And I think some of the ways that we might try and explain that would be that behind Charles Taylor, you have similar kinds of ideas, for example, in Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, German philosopher. And in Heidegger, you also have similar ideas to J.H. Bavinck, and the idea of that a personality is something that you must become. Yep. But I think that actually beyond both of them, you have a longer history of romanticism, romantic philosophy, that's just quite open to these insights about the world being somewhere that we live instinctually. And you can see this also in the background in the original neo-Calvinist context behind J.H. Bavinck. So I think Kuyper, he's really influenced by romanticism. And, Kuyper has a really fascinating speech on our instinctive life. And where he's really just tapping into, again, a lot of long-running things within romanticism and just trying to give an account for the ways that we do seem to live in the world in some kind of imaginative way like that as well. So I think that, J.H. Bavinck has a really compelling way to describe this and gives it a very useful handle in the idea of world vision, and then links that into the idea of personality as something that you want to treat not completely passively. You receive your personality to a degree, but then you should also want to be active as a personality to become a better person. Mm-hmm. So he does a lot of stuff that's quite unique there. But I think that at one level, he's like, a lot of people are itching for something quite particular here that gives a good account of the way that a lot of people, I mean, you can take this back to the Bible, okay, to like Isaiah saying, nobody stops to think. Like, so much of human life happens really, really passively, and it's possible to live a whole life as a human without ever really stopping to think very deeply about anything.
If you've read Daniel Kahneman, he talks a lot about this stuff too. The kind of first and second gears of thinking, that we're all very instinctual and not like as much thinking on the thing.
Okay, yeah, well, I need to look that up. So there are a lot of people in this context who all just have an itch there to find a really good concept that will give a good account of this. And world vision is J.H. Bavinck's way to do that. Charles Taylor comes along afterwards with something similar. So I think he's useful in plugging, like, in the neo-Calvinist tradition into that as a bigger conversation in philosophy.
Yeah,
I think Yeah, it's hard to unsee the world vision idea, actually. Once, I think, after I read this book, I was just kind of blown away by it a bit, and that it's such a usable idea, and really changes how you understand yourself, how you understand other people, in ways that are so helpful, and that it steers us away from a lot of triumphalism as well, and simplistic takes on people.
So my last quick question before Nick's, I'm going to combine some of mine, and you've already kind of touched on these, but the last chapter of this book was probably my favorite, and I think he really takes all of his philosophical, psychological, analytic thought, kind of channels it in the last chapter, and you can call it, I guess, the most practical chapter. People are looking for that, but like you have to trudge through it and see what he does to see where he ends up. Because he said if there's no objectivity, if there's nothing coming from outside of us, then yes, like it actually is truly relative, and all these worldviews, world divisions are gonna clash against each other. There's nothing you can do about it. There's no objective truth. So what is and you've already kind of answered this, but what's so vital then about God's revelation coming in and breaking in between these and saying, no, this is the objective truth. This is the objective worldview to not just break up, but to norm what you guys already think.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a really good question. So the way that the book ends in quite apocalyptic terms about Western culture. So, so for him, Western culture is in 1928. It's in a phase of very much living on borrowed Christian capital.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's using that to try and prop up other attempts to develop worldviews that are not livable, and those other attempts only ever run at a deficit, but you shore up the deficit by borrowing over and over from Christianity without acknowledging that that's where this life's livability sustaining source is actually from. And but then with every the longer that goes on, the more unfamiliar people become with Christianity, and the more alienated they are from it, and then eventually the borrowed capital actually dries up. And then he was really fearful about where this would end for Western culture. So for him, the great crisis facing Western culture was its lack of a worldview, and actually he says its lack of Christianity. And that's part of his belief that Christianity necessarily out-explains every other attempt at a livable philosophy. It's the most livable philosophy. But I think, at a really meta level, a really deep level in this book, the way that he's approaching that is also just profoundly Augustinian. In that, so if you know a bit of Augustine, he has this distinction between use and enjoyment, and it's really a way to flee idolatry. So if you try and use things within the creation to as though they were God themselves, they will only ever disappoint you. But the thing with created realities is that we use them as gifts, actually, to enjoy the giver. So you always have to look beyond whatever the thing is that you find in this time-space reality, this creation. You always look beyond that to the living, eternal God to enjoy Him, and that's actually the ultimate livable philosophy of life for Augustine, and also for J.H. Bavinck. That you have to live coram Deo within the world. So for him, the lack of Christianity in the West, its lack of a worldview, and its lack of concern for worldview, is really a lack of concern for God. And he has this very Augustinian suspicion, because of his doctrine of sin, that worldview building, although it's really essential and we need to care about it and pursue it, that it's also if you forget the use enjoyment distinction and how you build a worldview, and you try and you're idolatrous towards your worldview. Hey, I've got the right worldview. Look how sophisticated it is. It will always disappoint you as well. So the worldview is very much, or the worldview building is always, it's always the means and not the end. Maybe that's a good way to put it. So it's really important that we care about worldview, but always because the end beyond that is actually, if you care about a worldview, it's because you care about objective truth. But if you care about objective truth, for J.H. Bavinck, it's because you care about the Creator and you want to see God. You want to know God. And then you want that to be the thing that sets life in a particular hue for you. So, and I find that, so that for me, this was kind of mind-bending as well, in rethinking the pro and anti worldview debates in at least in American culture. It's less developed in the UK. where worldview is either, it's like it's the great savior or it's like this Trojan horse of pure evil. And J.H. Bavinck has such completely different ways to think about it in the first place that for him are really shaped by the gospel, actually, and so Augustinian in ways that are really rich to reflect on.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Some of my practical takeaways as I'm kind of wrapping up into my final question would be, all truth is God's truth, and when it comes to worldview, he has revealed who he is in Scripture, his gospel, right? And there's so much more to know about him that we don't know right now, but all truth is God's truth. And then more world vision is that we even have some subconscious assumptions based on the world we live in, and may be related but not limited to kind of a general revelation based on the world that we live in, the surroundings that we're in. So those are kind of the parameters that I'm kind of thinking. But my last question, being practical, is after this conversation, you're going to have some hopes of what people are going to do from here. So where do you hope readers go from here? How should they aid in their own worldview and our interactions with other competing worldviews?
Yeah, so I hope that readers will use the worldview concept to become self-aware, maybe in a new way, to reflect more on the home coordinates that they've received in God's providence, in history and in nature, in the world. And, the thing with the world vision is that as a starting point, it's actually a good thing for J.H. Bavinck. It's because you receive it by God's providence, that you're not born nowhere. You're born somewhere and at some time. And that's a really good thing, because he's thinking in the category of general revelation as both nature and history. So God actually puts you somewhere within a world that is good. So again, he's Augustinian in his account of evil as well, that evil is a disorder of the good, but it's not a thing in the world. So your world vision is a really good starting point, and you should thank God for it. And something I love about this book is that it helped me think in more thankful terms about where I'm from. But at the same time, your home coordinates can become a prison if you never put it to the way that it teaches you about the world and about God ultimately to the test. So the thing with a world vision is that it is initially a set of assumptions about the world or presuppositions that are untested. And that makes them subjective. And because you haven't put them to the test, you don't know if they're objectively true. And then actually you're really neglecting viewing your life coram Deo. And instead you only live before your particular space in the world and how it tells you to think about things and how to live. So I hope that the worldview concept is really useful for people, appreciatively and critically for them as human beings. And I hope then that helps them think about worldview differently as well, to understand that worldview really does matter so much. And but to think about worldview and how you see it well in much bigger terms rather than the whole worldview crammed into the individual. But then to make better sense of the broad cultures that we come from, for example. So I hope that it'll be useful in making people live and think more imaginatively and intelligently within the world as God's creation and themselves just here by God's providence.
Yeah, and I think coming from, I guess, for us, more specifically American Western individual, and how I heard worldview before, it was a good corrective for not just my worldview, but I think my understanding of what worldview is. And it's not like just a funnel, like I place myself in, I place other people in, and okay, now I can have conversations because I know who you are based off your worldview. And I think this is a good corrective on this stuff. But so as we end, to plug yourself to some of the stuff that's coming down the road for Bavinck and all the Bavinck family, I guess, and then as well as your podcast, Grace in Common, to plug that and what you guys are doing with those things as well.
Yeah, so I have a podcast that I co-host with Corey Bruck, Grace Utanto. I've mentioned them both already, I think, in their work here, and Marinus de Jong. It's called Grace in Common, and it's just an extended conversation about neo-Calvinist theology. We come from 4 different countries, drawn across 3 continents. So we're thinking from quite different world vision starting points, and trying to move towards the wisdom of worldview together, and drawing on these kinds of resources to do that. So if you're interested in neo-Calvinism, then that's a good resource.
I love the podcast. I would definitely recommend people to listen to it.
That's kind of you to say so. And there's another Herman Bavinck translation that's coming out this summer, also with Crossway. It's called Christianity and Science, and it's also a follow-up by Herman to Christian Worldview, but it's an attempt to try and apply the book Christian Worldview in a pretty specific way to the life of the mind. So if you are a university student, a college student, if you're thinking about education in general terms, either Christian education or being a Christian in an educational system, this is him trying to, again, show that Christianity out-explains other attempts at the life of the mind. So that comes out in August with Crossway.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on, talking about this book that you both edited and translated and had a lot of help in as well. But thank you for bringing the work or helping to bring the work of the Bavinck family to all sorts of people today, and to norm our worldviews and to understand that we're not doing this thing alone, that we can learn from our brothers and sisters in the faith and different cultures and all that stuff, and it helps us understand our own culture within other cultures. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about J.H. Bavinck and all the things that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
Of course.
Thank you.